Good evening. I'm going to talk to you about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and I should probably really be a member of the Reduced Shakespeare Company, because it's something that's been going on for about 60 years now, and to try and reduce it or to provide any useful observations in 15 minutes is a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to have a go. And I'm going to ask you in the 15 minutes to take on a bit of a challenge as well, because you, I'm sure, have come here with some views about this conflict, some loyalties, some preconceptions, maybe even some prejudices, and I'd just like you to drop them for 15 minutes, and then you can reassemble them afterwards. I'm not going to try and win you over on one side or the other, but I just try and, you know, it's like a very bad marriage, this conflict. It's got two, or at least two competing narratives, which, you know, most people from one side or other can't hear. So just for the moment, let's just try and forget those narratives that you might have. Now, it's good that I'm at a local event talking about this, because I got involved in this conflict by mistake. And in fact, the person who recruited me to this conflict was a man formerly known as Father Oliver in St Francis of Assisi in Pottery Lane, and I'm sure many of you know him, Oliver McTurnan, who has since left the priesthood and written a fascinating book called Violence in God's Name, in which he says one very important thing, which is that the reason why people fail to make peace in these tricky areas, used to be Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, the Middle East and so forth, is their insistence on creating a peace mechanism or a peace process that is exclusive. In other words, it excludes people from the process of serious constituency. And they're excluded because in this modern world we call them extremists. And we don't like extremists, and we particularly don't like religious extremists. Because in the modern world, us liberals have now turned anybody who seems to believe in a faith as being extreme, an extraordinary volte-face from maybe 60 years ago when us liberals were the extremists. Now, the interesting thing about our exclusion of these extremists from the conflict, or from the resolution of the conflict, is they're the people who will destroy any peace agreement that anyone makes. So if you don't have them as part of the process, you can't get very far. Now, Oliver asked me to a conference on the subject of political violence and religious conflict and so forth, and at this extraordinary conference were some senior Israelis and some senior Arabs from North African countries. And the usual things happen as happen in conferences, and both sides try to walk out on each other, and thankfully the various non-Arab and non-Israelis managed to keep them all in the same room together. But what intrigued me was that at the end of the conference I sat next to an Israeli general for dinner, and he turned to me and he said, "Do you know, this has been the most important 72 hours of my life." He said, "I've prosecuted them, I've judged them, and I've killed them. But I've never really met one before." And the hairs went up on the back of my neck. And he said, "I wish you'd do this for us and the Palestinians." So being an entrepreneur, having nothing to do with the world of politics or international affairs, I got on a plane with Oliver McTurnan, and we went to Israel. And we went to the Knesset. And the Knesset is the Israeli parliament. It's a fascinating place. Once you're in there, it's probably the most informal seat of power you'll ever come across. It's a place where people don't wear ties, where it's very, very busy and noisy, and the best place to be is the cafeteria. Because if you're in the cafeteria, you get access to everyone. And we started by talking to a couple of peaceniks, a well-known rabbi from the left, who was all very enthusiastic and supportive and everything else. But as we left that meeting, and I said to Oliver, "Well, that's a good start," he said, no, waste of time. He said, "We need the hardliners." And we went to see the hardliners. And interestingly, as we were waiting outside the office of the key hardliner from the Russian community, the rabbi who we just met went past and said, "Why do you want to talk to him? His views are beyond the pale." "Exactly," said Oliver. And we went to talk to him. And the most extraordinary thing came about. We sat and talked to him, and he said, as we chatted away, he said, "You know, no one's ever come to talk to me about peace before." And I thought, he's right. Oliver's absolutely right. So we then, through a little bit of knocking on doors, got to meet an Israeli general or two and persuaded them to give us some access to Gaza, where after a little bit of time, on the Woody Allen principle that 90% of success is showing up, we kept on showing up, and after a while we started to get to know the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad leadership. And of course, the same was true there. Nobody had come to talk to them about peace. In fact, nobody had come to talk to them at all. And I started to think, this is extraordinary. I've grown up all the way through this conflict. I've seen endless peace missions on the telly, endless frequent flyer politicians flying in and out and wagging their fingers, and endless peace conferences. But nobody talks to the people who really disagree with each other. In fact, in any weekend, pretty much, outside the religious festivals or holidays, you'll find in some smart country house or villa across Europe, Israelis and Palestinians earnestly nodding to each other and agreeing with each other. But these are the people who don't effectively have a crucial constituency, because the people that matter are the people who don't agree. Anyway, for the last 6 years, I've had the extraordinary privilege of shuttling between Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem and Damascus on an almost monthly basis, with both sides, ironically, knowing exactly who we meet on the other side. And while all of them would be publicly saying, "Oh, I would never talk to those people," or whatever, privately they're very, very happy to have somebody who goes in between and are able to tell them what the other people are saying and thinking. Now, people will tell you, therefore, after 6 years, that this is an impossible and implausible conflict to resolve. I think, actually, it's fantastically simple. It's incredibly straightforward. The first thing to understand is that if you took the top 1,000 people who run Israel, the generals, the securocrats, the intelligence officers, the politicians, and you took the top 1,000 Islamists, as they're called on the other side, from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, the religiously inspired communities, not one of them has ever met. Yet they all live in a space smaller than the size of Wales. Now let's have some maps. If we could have the pictures. You'll see here 4 maps, excuse the focus, but on the left-hand side, this first map is what was Palestine under the British Mandate. You may remember after the Second World War, the British were still in charge of vast tracts of the Middle East, and this is Palestine. And the plan was, the UN plan in the mandate, was in 1947 was to create 2 states. The Palestinian state, or the Arab state, was the yellow one, and the white state was the Jewish state. That was the state of Israel. Strange irony again, if we went back to biblical times, the Philistines lived in the white bit and the Jews lived in the yellow bit, but it doesn't matter. Now, what actually happened here, I better sit down again. This is the state of Israel, post-1948. You'll see that it wasn't quite what the UN had planned. In the Great Israeli War of Independence, another 25% or so was taken on the Israeli side. In this map here, it was about 50-50, 52% for the Jewish state, 48% for the Arab state. By this stage, we're up to 78% for the Jewish state and 22% for the Arab state. And over here is where things are now. About 12% of the original state of Palestine, or the land of Palestine, is where the Palestinians live, and therefore about 88% is currently controlled by the Israeli side of things. Okay, if we could move on map-wise, you'll see this a bit closer up. This is the West Bank. This is how things are at the moment. The yellow bits are where the Palestinians are. The white bits are under Israeli control. The blue triangles are Israeli settlements, or in most cases towns, and in some cases cities. And there is, as you can imagine, a network of roads which connect them all up. So this is what the argument is all about. Palestinians would like all of that bit to be yellow. Those are the 67 borders. That's what everyone talks about reverting to. The red and black line that you can see is the wall, the separation fence, the barrier, the wall, whatever you like to call it. And you can see that the wall goes snakes all around to the top, to the Jordanian border. And the Palestinians have significant fears that actually that wall could be continued all the way down to kind of lock them all in, as you might say, in a sort of giant cage. One more slide of maps to come. This is the Israeli proposal for the Palestinian state made to Yasser Arafat and Camp David in the year 2000. You'll see that the proposal allows for a Palestinian state that is really cut into 3 pieces. On the right-hand side, you'll see just next to Jordan, there is an Israeli-controlled border. The Palestinians believe that if they're going to have a state, it's got to be a country, it's got to border Jordan, it shouldn't be, as you might say, separated. And of course they would describe this offer as being not much more than what you might have had in the days in South Africa, and they call it Bantustans. These bits that come through, as you might say, that separate the 3 are where the major Israeli settlements are. And here's a close-up of Jerusalem. And you can see a similar problem. The grey bits are where the Palestinians would be allowed to exist, but as you can see, they're still split up into lots of little bits and pieces. So that's where we are at the moment. The United States government is, at least on the surface, apparently trying to create some proximity talks. That means that they'll rush in and out in between both sides rather than try and force both sides to sit down. But to be quite honest, those talks can't really take us very far, because they still exclude the Sinn Féin, as you might say, from the process. And without them being there, you've effectively always got, on one side, an Israeli argument, which seems perfectly fair, which is, how can we do business if we're only talking to half the Palestinians? But in the middle of all of this are certain, how can I describe it, certain barriers to entry, barriers to resolving this problem, which we're constantly told about. The first barrier, which would come from the Israeli side, is to say, I'm not going to talk to somebody who won't recognize my right to exist. You've probably heard that said a number of times. And historically, Yasser Arafat was asked to recognize Israel's right to exist and to renounce violence in advance of negotiations, which finally, tortuously, after I think it was 16, 17 years, he did. But of course, in the Palestinian narrative, he never got a Palestinian state. And given that the Palestinians are occupied, their line, and particularly the Hamas line, is we ain't going to recognize anyone or renounce any violence until we're confident we're going to get a Palestinian state. More importantly for them, in their narrative, and remember, as I said at the beginning, they're two competing narratives, but if you can't put yourself in the shoes of both sides, you cannot resolve the problem. In their narrative, the Palestinian narrative, recognition of Israel means recognizing the justification of the creation of the State of Israel, which to them was their Nakba, their disaster. It's to them similar to almost asking the people of Western Europe to recognize the German occupation of Western Europe. It's implausible to recognize it. You might recognize the reality of it because it's there, but you're certainly not going to recognize the justification of it. And these people have fought for 60 or more years over this particular issue. If I tell you that since 1948, 40% of Palestinian men have at one time or other been in prison, it will give you an idea of how committed these people are to trying to get what they believe is their justice and their homeland. Now flip to the Israeli narrative for a moment and you'll see the other problem. I don't have to bore you with the history of the Jewish people and what they've been through. And, you know, for those of you who understand the kibbutzim, green in the desert miracle that was Israel, and probably isn't any longer, you can see why Israel wants protection. So, you can see why we've got these two difficult competing narratives. But what's incredibly important for all of us to understand is that this situation was created by us, by our inability to live with our own Jews. We exported them because of what we did or what was done to them in the Second World War right across Europe. So for the Muslim world and the Arab world, this is a problem we brought to them because we couldn't handle it ourselves. The second crucial problem, which no one will ever talk about and never seems to appear on the media, and the real reason, in a way, why people are so antsy about creating a Palestinian state, is if there was a Palestinian state, it would be a democracy. And right across the Middle East, you'll find kings and autocrats, sheikhs and presidents who are trying to create their own family government that goes and succeeds from generation to generation. And if there was a democracy in Palestine, Hamas would play a part. They may not win the election, but they'd have an extremely important role. And like their Islamist cousins in Turkey, I think they'd probably do their job reasonably well. Enough, at least, to make the peoples of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Syria say, why can't we have democracy too? And of course what radicalizes people in the UK more than anything else with Muslim backgrounds is this tragedy. I haven't had time or a chance for even to talk to you about Gaza, but the one thing you ought to know about Gaza, because many of you were probably walking on the streets or at least thinking about walking on the streets 15 months ago, not one penny, not $1 of all the billions of aid that we heard about last year has gone into Gaza. Not one brick, not one bag of cement, nothing. And I can tell you this, more people are recruited to blow themselves up in the world because of Gaza and because of our inability to resolve this conflict than for any other reason. That's why it matters, not just for the moral or political reasons, but even for our own domestic security. Because if this blows up in our faces again, it won't just be on the streets of Jerusalem, it'll be right here in London. Thank you.